Okay, welcome back, folks. Let me get my screen share up here. I almost forgot to do that. Okay, here we go. I got so excited there talking to some of the people, I forgot to do my job. Well, we are talking about the American Civil War, and we are particularly talking about for the next couple of weeks or so, we're going to be talking about that period of time called antebellum America. That period between 1815 1861 roughly, which was the 40 years or so, 45 years previous to the Civil War, because the Civil War didn't just occur all of a sudden. In fact, the case the Civil War had tried to become uh, tried to actually start right at the beginning of the country. You remember when we talked about American scripture after the Articles of Confederation, I mentioned that people like Washington and Jefferson and Madison all really felt like the country was going to divide into two different areas at least. It didn't happen. And one of the purposes of writing the Constitution was to form that more perfect union that was created. Unfortunately, that perfect union was imperfect to the point that it finally ended up having to be pulled apart by a civil war. So let's look at what we talked about last week. Uh, First of all, we began our study of the history of the American Civil War by looking at why the Civil War remains of such great interest to people. Remember, I told you that more books have been written about the Civil War era than any other era in American history. We reviewed the cost of the Civil War in human lives, which well over 700,000 people. We really don't know. I'll be honest, folks. We know 600 and plus lives were lost in combat related and disease to soldiers. We have no idea of the civilian loss of life, and it's well over 700,000. There is no doubt about that. More than was lost in any other war in American history, more than World War II. I then related my own family legacy, not because it's important, but because remember, I told you I want to try to focus on the people of the war. I want to try to focus on making the war realistic to us as much as possible. It's important to study the battles and all this kind of stuff, but I'm more concerned about who was fighting the war because some of those characters that, particularly the leadership, were just extremely interesting. And then we looked at the theories about what caused the Civil War. And of course, the theories center around two main causes: slavery and preservation of the Union. And, you can argue back and forth all day long about which one was more important. The point of it is that both of them were important. And then we looked at how the founding fathers, many of whom were slave owners, ingrained the concept of slavery into our American scripture, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, in order to form that more perfect union that they were looking at. Uh, Unfortunately, by doing that, they laid the seeds for the Civil War. They had hoped, in all honesty, that slavery would die of its own attrition, that it would not have to be dealt with. They were hoping that as the country matured and grew, that slavery would just disappear. Didn't work out that way. And then we reviewed the three clauses of the United States Constitution specifically that protected slavery: the Three Fifths Compromise, the protection of the slave trade, the Fugitive Slave Clause. We reviewed these three things. Finally, we looked at what I call slavery by the numbers. What was the status of slaves in the United States in terms of numbers per state and all this? So that's what we did last week. What we're going to do this week and next week, we're going to focus on the rise of sectionalism. I like to say that the Civil War, the period before the Civil War, you can actually trace the causes of it. It's kind of like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs across 40 years. Uh, the old story, that, throughout history, people would leave crumbs of bread so somebody would know where they went. You can follow the breadcrumbs of sectionalism for the 40 years previous to the Civil War. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there are specific events, crises that just stepped us closer and closer to civil war. Now, there's always been division in this country. And again, we talked about that. Just look at our country today. I mean, there are so many divisions in this country. We are so polarized between red state, blue state, races, socioeconomic criteria, ethnic backgrounds, you name it. You know, we are just a polarized nation. We have deep divisions, and yet it seems like when we are threatened, it seemed like we kind of come together. I remember after 9/11, I was so proud of our country because it just seemed that it seemed like we dropped all those grievances, we dropped all those divisions, and we came together for a short period of time. It didn't last, unfortunately, but we came together for a short period of time to unite against a common enemy. But through this period that we're going to be talking about, this antebellum period, those concepts of sectionalism, where your loyalty to the interest of a region over the nation as a whole just seemed to become more exaggerated. Uh, Classic example, when Robert E. Lee, when the war broke out, Robert E. Lee was torn. He had been an officer in the federal army for almost 30 years, and he loved this country. And he was actually offered the leadership of the military in the North. And he, I just finished reading the biography of Lee. I've read one before, but I read another one. And, I remember that part of that biography where basically he said, I have to go back to the country I love. He was talking about Virginia. He wasn't talking about the United States. He was talking about Virginia. That was the sectionalism that existed in this country at this time. So, why was this sectionalism so there? Why were we such a divided country? Well, there's four main issues. Obviously, slavery. As the North became more and more industrialized and grew around manufacturing, slavery became non-existent, and slavery was outlawed on every northern state. And on the other hand, slavery became much more ingrained in the South. In fact, it's a little ironic. I didn't really realize this until I really began studying this. Most of us see the Industrial Revolution as helping the North. Actually, folks, at least in one single criteria, the Industrial Revolution kind of caused the rise of slavery in the South, and that was Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. Because remember, I told you a few minutes ago that the founders thought that slavery would die? Prior to Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin, cotton was not a really big issue in this country because it was so labor intensive and it just wasn't profitable to farm that much cotton. After the cotton gin was invented, a northern invention, it absolutely revolutionized the southern economy. And all of a sudden, cotton became king. So much so that by the beginning of the Civil War, cotton was the primary export of this country. It was extremely profitable to farm cotton in the South. And in order to farm it, you had to have slaves. So, in a sense, at least that one element of the Industrial Revolution fueled the rise in slavery, which is kind of ironic. I never really thought about that until I began reading and studying this. Of course, these economic differences we've just finished talking about here. The North was primarily based on industry and manufacturing increasingly, whereas the South was much more dependent upon enslaved labor to cultivate its cash crops, cotton, tobacco, indigo, which was very important at that time. It's a blue dye, if you don't know. And then there was the political power. If you look back at this country prior to the Civil War, a majority of the presidents were Southerners or Northerners who had Southern feelings. Uh, Remember, we had the Virginia dynasty. The first 4 out of 6 presidents were all Virginia, all slave owners, you know, and then it didn't get any better, you know. You had Andrew Jackson, you had it on and on and on. Now, there were a few, there were some of them out there that were not slave owners, and a few were from the North when the Whigs were kind of growing in power in the 1840s and 30s. But for the most part, the political power of this country lay in the South. However, with Western expansion after the purchase, the Louisiana Purchase, and after particularly the Mexican American War, where we opened up the Southwest and California and the settling of Oregon from Britain, all of a sudden the South saw their political power threatened, and they did not want to see that, and so they were really pushing for this sectionalism. They wanted to make sure that they continued to have the political power in this country. And finally, there was that old concept of states' rights. Um, again, this is an old controversy that's been around for a long time. Uh, the country was made as a result of the states coming together. So why couldn't the states pull it apart? You know, the states had more right. The union was built to serve the states, not the states, the union. Uh, it's an old theory. It's an old controversy, and it's still there, folks. We still fight this all the time in this country. So, from the end of the War of 1812 to the outbreak of the Civil War period, we call that the antebellum era. Several key events took place which escalated the tensions of the nation and ultimately led to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. So we're going to look at the trail of breadcrumbs over the next 2 weeks. That's what I know that's kind of a funny thing, but it really is. You can see certain events that occurred in this antebellum period which just seemed to push us towards the Civil War. So, in retrospect, we were a nation of two sections. We had the slave owning, slave labor South, which depended on agriculture, and you had the manufacturing of the North, which did not include slavery at all, or at least, slavery like we considered it. It had kind of, indentured servitude and, low salaries and all this, but it wasn't the same for sure. Okay, now the first breadcrumb was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. If you happen to have been with me some couple of years back when we talked about the Ozarks, you know that we spent some time on the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was an extremely important event. It kind of started this trail of breadcrumbs that led to the Civil War. It was the first attempt to politically directly deal with the sectional rivalry over slavery in the 1820s. So here's what happened. In brief, Missouri was the first state to be carved out of the Louisiana Territory. Remember, Louisiana Territory was purchased in 1803, but no states had been carved out of it until Missouri was carved out in the late started in 1819, trying to get it. It was a big state, had a huge population. By the time it had actually been admitted into the Union, it far exceeded the population requirements to become a state. It had far exceeded the territorial status. But it also had a large slave population, approximately about 15%, about 10,000 to 67,000 residents in 1818 were slaves, mostly centered around that area of the Missouri River in central Missouri called Little Dixie, and that area down along the Mississippi River. The northern part of Missouri, the southwestern part of Missouri, primarily slavery existed, but it was very minimal in comparison to the area along Little Dixie area in the Mississippi River. Well, 1818, Missouri applies for statehood. It immediately ran into trouble. And in 1819, Representative Talmadge of New York, who was an ardent abolitionist, introduced an amendment banning slavery in Louisiana Territory. Up to that point, nothing had been talked about in terms of banning slavery because nothing had happened in that area. And he said, we need to ban slavery in the Louisiana Territory. So any state carved out of the Louisiana Territory had to be a non-slave state. And obviously that was not going to be the case with Missouri. It was the first serious challenge to the extension of slavery. It took Missouri 3 times, 3 different attempts to get into the Union. It finally came about as a result of a compromise authored by a new man by the name, Henry Clay. Henry Clay had burst upon the scene in the late 1819, 1820. And in 1821, he came up with a compromise. And he said, why don't we do this? Why don't we let Missouri come in as a slave state? But we will draw a line at the 3630-degree parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri, and that any state above that line will come in as a free state, and any state below that line, of which at that point in time there were no areas to let states in, would be allowed to come in as slave states. That proved to be acceptable to enough people on both sides that Missouri was admitted into the Union as a slave state, stuck up like a sore thumb. Look at this. Kentucky and Virginia and Delaware and Maryland had already been admitted in as slave states, but they said, we're going to draw this line now. And this line is to extend out here at the 3630 line. And any state up in this part, the orange part of the Louisiana Territory, will come in as free states. None of this belonged to the United States in 1820 and 1821. So, but the anticipation was that somewhere along the line it may. And so that was enough for the southern state to vote for. By the way, if you want to do the quick counting, and I did, there's 15 slave states, there's 15 non-slave states in 1820 with the admission of Missouri. So, there was a balance struck there. That was the compromise of 1820. Everybody thought that that might solve the problem. It didn't. So, what was the next breadcrumb on the way to civil war? Well, the next breadcrumb that I can see is Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. If there was one fear the Southern slave owners had, it was the fear of slave revolt. I mean, you remember back when we looked last week at the percentage of slaves, some of these states were well over 50%. More slaves than non-slaves in some of the deep South states. So the slave owners did everything they could to make sure that slaves were not armed and that they were under control so there would not be any slave rebellions. Now, there had been outbreaks, but very minimal. Maybe a couple of slaves, had tried to break away and done some violence. For the most part, though, in the early part of the antebellum period, slave rebellions were basically unheard of because, frankly, the slave owners had such tight controls on the slaves that they couldn't do anything. Well, 1831, that all changed because the most notorious incident of slave rebellion occurred in Virginia, in the southeastern part of the state, the Tidewater part, led by a man by the name of Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a black preacher. He was a slave, but he had his own little congregation amongst the slaves. He was kind of an educated person. He could read and write. He had some education. He was a very charismatic person. And he decided, it's a long story, and I'm not going to get into it, but it all had to do with his visions that God was appointing him to lead a rebellion, and all the slaves in the world were going to rise up under his authority. And he got enough followers that in August of 1831, they broke loose and they went on a killing rampage in southeastern Virginia, killed between 55 and 65 white people, the most deadly slave revolt in U.S. history. Now, if you want to get the attention of the slave owners in the South, that's exactly what happened. I mean, they were alarmed to no end. You know what the reaction was. They immediately got the white militia. Each state had a militia. They gathered up in Virginia and they went on a rampage themselves. And they ended up killing 120 enslaved people. Some of them were followers of Turner, some of them were not. They even killed some free blacks in retaliation. Finally, most of Turner's followers were captured, and frankly, most of them were killed immediately. Turner somehow survived for 6 weeks. He was hidden in caves at the plantation of some friendly slaves that had hid him there. He was finally captured on the Belmont plantation in October. So the slave rebellion went on for about 2 months. Taken to a prison in Jerusalem, Virginia, ironic name, and while waiting trial, he confessed knowledge of the rebellion and gave some interviews to a newspaper reporter by the name of Thomas Gray, who later on published a book called The Confessions of Nat Turner. That is not the book that came out in the late 1960s, early 1970s. This came out, in the 1830s. And basically, he admitted to what he had done. Turner was quickly tried and convicted, and the white people wanted to make sure and make a symbol out of Nat Turner. So they did some pretty horrible things to this man. They beheaded his body after he was hung. They dissected it. They flayed the skin. They made souvenir purses out of his skin. He was just, he became a symbol of what you better not do, or this is what will happen to you. As a result of the Nat Turner Rebellion, several things begin to come into play in the South. Up to this point, the slave owners have pretty much let the slaves have their own church and their own preachers as long as they, kept in line. At this point, they outlawed services unless they were led by a white man. They also forbid allowing slaves to read and write. Now, some of them did, but for the most part, they would not allow anyone to teach them how to read and write. And they criminalized teaching blacks to read and write, restricting blacks from holding religious meetings without a licensed white minister. By the way, if you want to read a book about the Confessions of Nat Turner, this is the book that came out in the late 60s, early 70s. I got a feeling some of you out there have probably read it. I read it a long, long time ago. It's a novel. It's a historical novel. It's not a history book, but it's pretty well done. In fact, it was a really big seller in the 1970s. And it tells the story of Nat Turner in novel form. And it's really a pretty good book. I'm sure some of you probably remember reading. I haven't read it in 50 years, but I can remember it still to this day. Okay, the next breadcrumb occurred a couple of years later, actually about a year later, the nullification crisis of 1832. So here's what happened here. In 1828, Congress, under the leadership of John Quincy Adams, who was the last of the old founders of this country, he was the son of John Adams, he passed a protective tariff, which became known as the Tariff of Abominations. It was really placed a heavy tax burden on the agrarian South. And John Quincy Adams was a notorious anti-slave person. He was one of the first leaders of this country to really come out against slavery in such a large, amount of talk. I mean, he was really a big proponent of the anti-slavery movement. Of course, he was defeated in 1828, by Andrew Jackson, who was a Westerner, but he was also a slave owner. Well, when Andrew Jackson took office, everybody in the South thought, okay, we're going to be okay. Andrew Jackson is going to do away with the tariff, and everything's going to be okay. He didn't. He did not do away with it. There's a long story about that, but we're not going to get into it. Suffice to say, he didn't do away with it. It enraged the South to no end. In fact, the case, his vice president was a man by the name of John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun was so enraged by Jackson's failure to do away with the leadership on the tariff abominations that he actually resigned his office of vice president, went back to South Carolina, and became the most outspoken proponent of the theory of nullification. So we talked about this way back, but let's talk again about it. Nullification is the theory that if a state believed a federal law was unconstitutional, it could declare that law null and void. Now, there nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. And you have to really stretch the limits of interpretation to come up to a theory that makes any sense out of nullification, because the Constitution is pretty clear about this. That federal law can't be ruled unconstitutional by the states. But that was his theory, and he laid out a pretty convincing argument, convincing enough that Jackson became so enraged over this that he threatened violence against the state of South Carolina. And then he kind of said, "Okay, wait a minute, let's take this down a notch here, okay? Or we're going to end up with civil war. We're going to fight South Carolina, by using weapons." And so he introduced a law. He had Congress, his followers in Congress, introduced a law called the Tariff of 1832, which was kind of mollified most of the North and much of the South, but not South Carolina. They were at this point, so enraged over his failure to not do away with the tariff of abominations that they wouldn't even listen to his compromise. And what did they do? They actually ordered the state militia of South Carolina to arm themselves, and they actually began to make military preparations. So if the federal government tried to enforce this new tariff, that they were going to militarily use force to deny it. And Jackson almost went to war against South Carolina. It took a lot of talking to talk him out of this. Finally, Congress passed another compromise tariff, which finally cool heads prevailed, and they said, okay, we could live with this, and everything kind of simmered down. But the idea of nullification never went away. And it raises its head again in 1860 and 1861, which led to the secession of these states. So the nullification crisis of 1832 was an extremely important breadcrumb on the trail to the Civil War. So you had these two guys here, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, who had been kind of political allies to the point that Calhoun was actually his vice president. All of a sudden, they become sworn enemies. You want to read about some interesting things, read about these two characters, because they absolutely were both, hot-tempered Scots-Irishmen who, really, took it to the limit. Let's put it that way. Okay. Well, as a result of simmering down after the tariff of the nullification crisis, 1832, things kind of settled down for about 15, 18 years or so, mainly because you had a triumvirate of new leaders in the country. Henry Clay, who had gained prominence with the Missouri Compromise; Daniel Webster, who was from the states up in the Northeast, and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. These three people, although they very differently, were able to compromise enough that it seemed like things kind of cooled down for the next 15, 18 years. And these three people formed something called the Great Triumvirate of the antebellum period. And they were the new leadership. They replaced the old Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison. These guys were all gone now. And this became the new political leadership of this antebellum period. And they had some successes, they had some failures. Unfortunately, they all died by about 1850. And when they died, things really began to fall apart. These three kind of kept us together in a way. If you want to read some very interesting biographies, I'll point one out here in just a minute. Okay. Well, like I said, these three kept us together till the latter part of the 1840s. What happened in the 1840s? We went to war against Mexico. We fought the Mexican-American War, and we won. We carved out a lot of the West. The old territory of the Southwest, except for California, was carved out of, of this Mexican-American War. All of a sudden, the question rose again, what are we going to do about slavery? Remember, the Missouri Compromise had left it open to slavery. But the abolitionists in the North and Northeast said, absolutely, we're not going to stand for that. That was way back 30 years ago. We had no idea this was going to happen, they said. Well, you had another compromise, the Compromise of 1850, brokered by Henry Clay again, and a newcomer on the scene. Remember, the name is Stephen Douglas, who was from Illinois. Stephen Douglas was a rising. He would become the political power of the 1850s. Ended up, he angered everybody, but at least there for a period of time, he was kind of the political power maker of the 1850s. Henry Clay, this was one of those last acts before he died. He came up with a compromise. It was actually a package of 5 separate acts that at least temporarily diffused all the anger that had arisen over what to do with the western part of the nation that we had annexed as a result of the Mexican-American War. So, in a nutshell, what it did was allow California to enter as a free state. And it also set the boundaries of Texas. Texas had been kind of out there in terms of where actually Texas was. Well, now we set the boundaries. And Texas obviously would come in as a slave state. It also addressed some other things. It addressed the fugitive slaves, which we'll talk about, and it also addressed the slave trade in the District of Columbia. It was a compromise. It gave a little bit to everybody. Everybody thought this was it. They thought, oh, okay, we've saved the Union. The Compromise of 1850, we've got this done now. The nation is pretty well within its boundaries. The boundaries that we now see in the United States was there. We had set the standards for what was going to be slave and what was going to be non-slave. So everything was settled. Yeah, no, it wasn't, because the 1850s turned out to be the worst decade of all the sectionalism that we have seen. And the seeds of the Civil War were definitely sown in the 1850s. So here is the result of the Compromise of 1850. You can see that the country is basically established now. The borders that we know of, except for Alaska and Hawaii. All the states in green and the territories were admitted in as free states. Texas, the Indian territories were slave areas. All these areas down here, New Mexico and Utah territory were open to slavery by principle by a concept known as popular sovereignty. And we're going to talk about that because that becomes very, very critical in this trail of breadcrumbs that lead to the Civil War. By the way, if you want to read an excellent book about this group of new political leaders, this second generation of American political leaders, I would highly recommend this book. It's called Heirs of the Founders. It's a kind of a biography of these three men together: Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. And it's written by an excellent historian by the name of H.W. Brands. He has written a lot of history books, and he is an excellent writer. And I read this actually over the winter before I even knew for sure I was going to be doing this. And it's just an excellent book if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So, what else came about as a result of the Compromise of 1850? Well, one of the things that happened was this. As a result of the compromise, Henry Clay said, well, we're going to give the North some things, we're going to give the South some things. And one of the things they gave to the South was a new Fugitive Slave Act, which was really tight, folks. It was really strict. And while it kind of mollified the South, it absolutely enraged the abolitionists of the North. Because here's what it did: it required all federal authorities to assist in the return of escaped slaves to their owners. And if you didn't assist them, then you could be fined or arrested. So, it was a really huge development on the part of the fugitive slaves. This meant that slavers in the South could come into free territories looking for their slaves. And if they found them or thought they found them, they could go to any law enforcement officer and say, hey, this person over here is my escaped slave. All it took was a claimant's sworn word. So let's say somebody from Mississippi could come to Ohio, and he would go into Cincinnati, and he would look around and he would see this guy, and he said, that's my escaped slave. I recognize him. He could go to any law enforcement officer and say, swear out an affidavit that this person was his slave. And they would take this person and they would hand him over to the slave owner, and he could take him back to the South. Now, you can just imagine the fury that went on. I mean, I don't want to get political, but think about what's going on in our own country today, and think about the antagonism that is out there against ICE and all these agencies in some of these sanctuary cities where they're going in and arresting illegal aliens and shipping them back south. And we all know that it's causing a huge turmoil in this country right now. On one part, you've got people that are applauding and clapping their hands and saying it's about time. On the other hand, you've got people that are saying it's horrible, and it created all sorts of dissension then. It's creating all sorts of dissension now. So it made it even harsher for a person aiding a runaway slave. If you aided a runaway slave, you were subject to 6 months imprisonment or $1,000 fine. So what you saw was this kind of thing. And in cities like Boston, the abolitionists were hanging these up. They were saying, caution, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the air welfare of your fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, or so many hounds of the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp eye and look out for kidnappers and have top eye open. April 24th, 1851. In a sense, they were sanctuary cities, and they were cautioning the people, the minority population, to not cooperate with this. So, what was the result of this? Well, the result of this was the creation of what became known as the Underground Railroad. This was one of the responses to the Fugitive Slave Act. And in the 1850s, it had already been around, but it really grew in the 1850s. You began to have the secret network of routes and safe houses called the Underground Railroad. It was established in the antebellum America that was designed to help escaped slaves relocate to free states and Canada, principally. Now, it wasn't a railroad, and it wasn't literally underground. The reason it's called that is because they used terminology that kind of drew up allusions to railroads. They had agents, conductors, stations, passengers, depots. They would use these terminology to set these underground, these safe houses up. It's estimated. Nobody knows for sure, folks, because frankly, it was a secret movement to some degree. But it's estimated there was about 150,000 escaped slaves in the 1850s were ferried prior to the Civil War. We don't know for sure, but the best estimates are about 150,000 slaves were helped to escape slavery up into the northern states and principally Canada. A lot of them ended up in Canada. Some very famous Americans are involved. The names we conjure up: Harriet Tubman, John Brown, Frederick Douglass. And this is a map. It's not a very good map, but it shows kind of how the Underground Railroad kind of operated. And you can see it just basically as a bunch of arrows from some of these slave states up to the north. This is a guy who had a station, a hidden room in his house that he found, which was part of the Underground Railroad. There are several of these that are still in existence in the world, in America today, and they're actually kind of tourist attractions today. So, one of the most famous people, and this is where we're going to stop today, one of the most famous people associated with the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a slave herself, born in 1822 in Maryland, and she escaped in 1849 from her owners, made her way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and she decided she was going to help free slaves. Over the next several decades, she successfully led over 70 slaves and 13 expeditions that we know of to help slaves escape their owners in the South. She became known as the Black Moses. She was just an extremely important character, although she was basically unknown at the time. This all came about later after the Civil War, that she became a kind of a celebrity. But she was known by the Black people and she was known by the abolitionists. It's just that the majority of the people didn't know anything about her. One of her last missions, by the way, was to retrieve her own parents and took them to Canada. She lived a long life. She later told an audience, she said, "I was a conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years. I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." She was a pretty good speaker. And by the way, she continued on during the Civil War. She acted as a spy and a scout for the Union Army. Like I said, she was kind of unknown at this period of time. She didn't really become a celebrity until after the Civil War. And then she began to work for women's suffrage after the Civil War. She had a famous saying. She said, "I've suffered enough to believe I ought to have the right to vote." And I don't know if that's where the term suffrage came from, but it definitely gives the illusion. She lived until 1911. Think about that, folks. She was born in 1822 and lived in 1911. Died at her home of Auburn, New York, in 91. Terrific story. If you want to read a book about Harriet Tubman, and I read this some years back, I have, it's been a long while since I read it, but Bound for the Promised Land by a lady by the name of Kate Clifford Larson wrote the book. And there's also a really good book about the Underground Railroad, which I have not read. I'm not going to lie to you, but it was good enough to win the Pulitzer Prize. So I'm assuming it's a pretty good book, written by Colson Whitehead about the Underground Railroad. So that's it for today. we are going to continue our look at the breadcrumbs next week. We're going to continue looking at the events that led up to the Civil War. And that's what we'll do next week. We'll continue looking at the decade of the 1850s, particularly the events in Kansas and the events of John Brown and some of these things that took place. A lot of breadcrumbs in the 1850s. You can see the Civil War coming. I mean, there's no doubt it's going to happen. And it was pretty obvious by the mid 1850s or so. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. I always encourage you to keep on being lifelong learners. That's such an important thing for us to do at this stage of our life. So keep up the good work, and I hope to see you next week. And so long until then.